There was a particular kind of silence that settled over a room when Marvin Gaye sang without preparation. Not the polished silence of a concert hall, not the manufactured quiet of a recording booth, something closer to the stillness that follows an unexpected confession. The kind of silence where no one moves because moving would mean acknowledging that something irreversible just happened. Quincy Jones had spent the better part of a decade learning to recognize that silence in other rooms, in other cities, in the presence of other voices. He had not expected to find it here, in someone's living room in Los Angeles. At the end of a night he had already decided to forget. He had rejected Marvin twice. The first time was brief, a scheduling conflict used as a polite excuse, though the truth was simpler. Quincy had heard the records. He had listened to the Motown output, the carefully constructed romantic ballads, the duets engineered for radio. He heard a voice that was technically accomplished, smooth in the way the label required, shaped by production decisions he could trace from the first bar. What he did not hear was something that surprised him. And if a voice did not surprise Quincy Jones, there was nothing to discuss. He had built his career on the gap between what a voice could do and what it chose to do in the space between the notes. Marvin, on record, filled every space. Quincy needed someone who understood what to leave empty. The second rejection came a year later and required even less deliberation. Someone at the label had made the introduction again, framing it differently this time, emphasizing the sales figures, the cultural moment, Marvin's commercial relevance. Quincy listened to the pitch and declined without explanation. He was not interested in commercial relevance. He was interested in what happened when a musician stopped performing for the room and started performing for something he couldn't name. He had heard that quality in Miles, in Ella, in a handful of others over the years, each time recognizing it the way you recognize a word in a language you didn't know you had learned. He had not heard it in Marvin Gaye. That was his considered opinion, formed and filed away. He moved on to other things. It was a conclusion he had reached without drama and without regret. Quincy Jones did not spend much time on regret. He moved through the world with the efficiency of someone who had learned early that talent was not the rarest resource in the music industry. Attention was, specifically the right kind of attention, directed at the right source, at the moment when it could still make a difference. He had directed his attention elsewhere. That was the end of it. The party was not the kind of event either of them would have chosen. It was a gathering of industry figures at a house in the hills, the sort of evening that existed primarily as an opportunity for people to confirm their own relevance to each other. Quincy had arrived with a specific purpose, a conversation he needed to have with a director who was considering him for a score, and planned to leave within an hour. The rooms were full of the particular energy of people performing casualness, voices pitched slightly too loud, laughter arriving a beat too early. Marvin came in late, alone, moving through the rooms without stopping, the way people do when they are present in a body but somewhere else entirely in their mind. Quincy noticed him the way you notice furniture, registered his presence, assigned him to the background, returned his attention to the conversation in front of him. They exchanged a brief acknowledgement at some point in the evening, the minimal courtesy of two people who share professional geography without sharing much else. Marvin nodded. Quincy nodded back. The moment lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then both of them moved on, absorbed by the separate gravitational fields of their own evenings. By midnight, the party had thinned. The director Quincy needed to speak with had left early, which meant the entire justification for being there had dissolved. But he stayed anyway, held by the low-level inertia of a comfortable chair and a conversation about something he no longer remembered. Marvin was standing near the window at the far end of the room, holding a glass, not drinking from it, looking at something outside or at the reflection of the room in the glass. It was impossible to tell which. Someone was playing piano in the adjacent room. Nothing deliberate, just the sound of a person working through something at low volume, exploratory, uncommitted. Marvin set his glass down on the nearest surface. He didn't look around to see who was paying attention. He didn't shift his posture into anything that resembled preparation. He simply began to sing quietly into the space in front of him, as though he was continuing a conversation he'd been having with himself for hours. No announcement, no visible decision, Just the voice, arriving without ceremony. Quincy heard it before he processed it. His body registered something and went still a full second before his mind caught up with the information. The voice was not doing what it did on the records. There was no forward momentum, no push toward the listener, none of the smooth professional energy that Marvin had been trained to project. Instead, the sound was pulling inward. He was singing underneath his own range, finding a place in the lower register where the voice lost its polish and became something rougher, closer to breath than tone. And then, without warning, he would let it rise, not in the calculated arc of a trained vocalist demonstrating control, but the way a question rises at the end of a sentence when the person asking it genuinely doesn't know the answer. Quincy found himself turned around in his chair. He didn't remember deciding to turn. The voice had made that decision for him. What he was hearing was not a performance. That was the thing that had escaped him entirely from the recordings. And he understood in this moment why it had escaped him. Because in a studio, under production, surrounded by arrangement and instrumentation, even the most honest voice gets framed. The frame tells you how to listen, it tells you what the voice is doing and why, and it positions you at a comfortable distance from the sound. What Marvin was doing now had no frame. It was simply occurring the way weather occurs, not for anyone in particular, not shaped by expectation of response, just the sound of a man working something out in real time. And that meant there was no distance. You were either inside it or you weren't in the room. Quincy was inside it. The song, if it was a song, if it had a name he could have identified, moved slowly, almost without rhythm, the melody drifting forward and then pulling back in ways that made it impossible to anticipate the next phrase. Marvin's eyes were closed, or nearly closed, his body barely moving, one hand hanging at his side and the other resting on the window frame. He wasn't performing for the people remaining in the room. He might not have been fully aware there were people remaining in the room. He was engaged in something private that had simply become audible, and the people around him were present by accident rather than by invitation. The conversations in the room had stopped. Not dramatically. No one had asked for quiet. No one had made a show of paying attention. They had simply stopped, the way conversations stop when the background changes into something that cannot be ignored. Someone near Quincy set down a glass without making a sound. The person who had been talking to him a moment before had turned to face the window. The piano in the other room had gone quiet. There is a particular kind of listening that has nothing voluntary about it. You do not choose to do it. It happens to you, the same way a sudden cold enters a room through an open door. Quincy had experienced it fewer than a dozen times in his life, and each time it had left him slightly altered, as though the listening itself rearranged something internal that could not be put back in its original position. He recognized it now the way you recognize the early symptoms of something you have had before. Not with alarm, but with a kind of resigned acknowledgement that whatever comes next will require your full presence, whether you intended to give it or not. Quincy sat with his hands open in his lap and listened. He was hearing what he had told himself Marvin was incapable of, not because of a limitation in the voice itself, but because of what surrounded it, and because he had made the mistake of evaluating the rapper instead of what was inside. The voice on the records was Motown's voice, shaped and positioned, and served to an audience that knew exactly what it was receiving. This voice belonged to no institution. It had no product to sell. It was operating in the register where a person makes sounds not to be heard, but because the alternative, silence, stillness, the unbroken weight of whatever is inside, is no longer bearable. Quincy had spent his career chasing musicians who could reach that register while still making something coherent, something that held together as music even when it came from that raw and unguarded place. Most couldn't do it. Most collapsed into either pure emotion with no structure or pure technique with no feeling. The ones who could hold both things simultaneously, who could be completely exposed and completely in control at the same moment, those were the ones who changed what music was capable of. He was watching one of those people sing to a window in someone's living room at midnight. When Marvin stopped, the silence lasted longer than it should have. He opened his eyes, looked at the glass he had left on the surface nearby, and picked it up again. His posture changed slightly. He came back into himself, back into the room, back into the social geometry of a party that was ending. He didn't look around to see what effect he had produced. He seemed genuinely uninterested in the effect. He drank from the glass and remained standing at the window, his attention drifting back to whatever he had been watching before. Quincy stayed in his chair for a moment longer than was natural. The person next to him said something, and Quincy made a sound that could have been agreement. His mind was already somewhere else, already making the first small movements toward a recalibration that would take the rest of the night to complete. He had been wrong, and he understood, with the particular clarity that comes only from direct experience, that the wrongness had not been in his methods. He had applied his methods correctly to the evidence available. The error was in the evidence. He had been listening to the recording of a voice, not the voice itself. And the distance between those two things in Marvin's case was not a gap. It was a different country entirely. He left the party without seeking Marvin out. There was nothing to say that night, and Quincy was not the kind of man who manufactured conversational monuments to moments that had already made themselves clear. He drove home through quiet streets and sat in his car for several minutes after parking, which was not something he normally did. The next morning, he looked at his calendar and made 2 calls. The first call rearranged the following 3 weeks. The second call was to someone who knew how to reach Marvin Gaye. He had turned him down twice. He did not intend to need a third attempt at finding his way back. Some mistakes you can afford to repeat. The mistake of underestimating a voice, of assuming that what a label does to a sound is the sound itself, was not one of them. Quincy had learned that once before, early in his career, and the lesson had cost him something he never fully recovered. He was not interested in paying the same price again for the same lesson dressed in different clothes. Some things you hear once and understand completely, and the understanding arrives not as an idea but as a physical fact that rearranges the furniture of everything you thought you knew. That was what the window in that room in Los Angeles had given him. Not an opinion, not a revised assessment, a correction that arrived too late to be useful in the past but was still, even now, early enough to matter.